Okay, so we're live. I'm just going to wait for the event to go live at 11, which is now. Here we go. Good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait for a few more to attend. We'll be going live maybe 30 seconds or so. Okay, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping. So I would like to thank Lindsay and Jerry for agreeing to work with us on this event today. Clearly, I'd like to thank you all for attending the event as well. So thank you for giving up your time. And a big thanks to Matt Trinder from the Circular Computing marketing team, who has put this together for us and always does a great job of making us look exceptional. So before we jump in, I'd like to mention a couple of things. There is on the right hand side a chat box which you can engage with us, and we would really like you to kind of get involved in this session if you would. There's not going to be any PowerPoint slides. It's going to be a conversation around sustainability and social value themes. We will be conducting an in-session poll. So what that will look like is just a set of questions from which then we're able to sort of judge where content and communications needs to head for you, the audience. After the show, there'll be a follow-up email with information about the presenters and the results of the poll. And I think that's going to be it. So thank you very much. Right. So I would like to just throw open a question to Lindsay and to Jerry. Maybe with yourself starting, Jerry, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the working from home and the educating from home culture that's moved in over the course of the pandemic, do you think that has in some way reshaped how people view sustainability and social value?
I think it definitely has, and I think for probably a number of different reasons. I think there was a concern that when the pandemic first happened, it would derail a lot of the sustainability initiatives. And we saw that, maybe in specific ways. You saw things like the environmental bill paused because obviously COVID was top of the agenda. But I think for individuals out there, we've seen that groundswell of interest. There was a statistic from Google early in the pandemic about the interest in searching about how to live a sustainable lifestyle. They saw a search trend of 4,500% increase in people searching for that. And we kind of had, I think in 2019, we'd seen, the interest that Greta Thunberg had created, the sort of climate protests. So there was, I think, a wave of interest before this, but it's continued through the year. And I think people have taken the time, at least one of the benefits of working remotely and educating remotely is, and the lockdowns, I guess, is we have in some ways more time in our hands, and people have had time to think about their lifestyle and what the future will hold for them. And I'm not sure if the new normal is going to be that new or if there is a great reset, but I think people do want things to start back differently. And we've seen the interest, we've seen it through individuals, we've seen it through government announcements about desires, from the EU, from the British government. We've seen it from sort of investor groups as well, putting pressure for a green restart, a green relaunch to the economy. We've seen changes, across the ocean in America as well. I think with the presidential change, more interest. So I think absolutely people see this as an opportunity to do things differently. And let's hope that it's not a wasted opportunity.
How about you, Lindsay?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's absolutely accelerated people's thought processes and people's approach to how they consider sustainability and social value. And quite interestingly, I was speaking to a customer last week who made a comment that she thought it had shifted their kind of strategy and direction forward by about 3 to 5 years in terms of their thinking, their home working policies. That whole work-life balance, that flexible approach had all moved quite significantly in the last 12 months. And I do think it comes down to, as Jerry says, that people have actually took a step back and reflected, and everybody, I think, always had that base understanding of what is important. But now I think it's highlighted that it's a real time to bring that change, and people are taking positive steps towards that. The homeschooling situation, I think, does highlight the need to improve infrastructure, to improve access to equipment that is not necessarily readily available for everybody. I've found homeschooling quite hard. I'm sure lots of people had, and I will be happy when we go back. But I think that just as well for the younger generation, I think it's give them quite a lot of exposure to things that they might not have had if they had just been in traditional school. And we've been talking about different things. We've been talking about different areas of their curriculum as well. So across the board, I certainly think it's accelerating the change towards more sustainable and social value options.
From the public sector, Lindsay, can you just give the audience an idea of your background and what you're doing with Value-Match?
Yeah, of course. So my background is public sector procurement. I'm CIPS qualified. Spent around 20 years working with a local authority in the northeast of England. Done some time with the local buy-in consortium in the northeast as well. So always been involved in procurement, leading generally professional services and IT procurement. Around four years ago, left public sector procurement and moved into the private sector, but moved to a private organisation who was very much focused on still delivering public sector procurement. So led a team of client services team responsible for around £250 million worth of spend annually within professional services, and that was to central government, local government, NHS, higher education, blue light, so all different sectors. And based on that kind of experience of both public and private procurement, but ultimately always kind of the private side's always been working back into public sector to achieve the outcomes that they are trying to deliver within, have quite detailed knowledge of the legislation and things that are in place that public sector have to adhere to. So based on that experience, I'm now doing a lot of work with suppliers within Value-Match to help them bid back better, to make sure that we can align to public sector requirements, but also bridge the gap between and translate what happens in the public sector into the private sector so we can get the best offers there. For Value-Match, I am Services Director, and Value-Match is a purpose-led procurement organisation. We deliver procurement consultancy, bid management, supporting suppliers, as I've just mentioned, and procurement training. So really we do anything related to procurement as a core capability. Our overall kind of aim and objective is supporting individuals or our customers to do better, to get the outcomes that they want to achieve in a compliant, in values-based manner, hence Value-Match.
And in terms of, thank you, Lindsay, sorry. In terms of Citrix, Jay, just for the audience, could you just give a snapshot as to Citrix and to their view on sustainability and where you kind of fit in?
Yeah, absolutely. I work in product management and marketing for Citrix. I'm a product strategist, so looking at how our products meet our customer requirements and how we match them to the market. I became involved in a project within Citrix that started in December 2019, looking at how we could help our customers achieve their sustainable goals. And what we really looked at is we have a set of products that help people, potentially reduce their need for high energy devices, can make data center efficiencies, but also really importantly, reduce the need for unnecessary commuting. Because what we found is that if you look at the overall impact of ICT and include commuting in that, it contributes to about 5% of global emissions, which is a huge amount. I think it's about 2.7 billion tons of emissions from ICT, which, to put that in perspective, will require forestry the size of Greenland and Canada combined to sequester that from the atmosphere. So we really looked at sort of launching a program, working with our customers, initially in Northern Europe, about how the technologies we have could help them. But we also use that as a sort of a way to accelerate what we were doing as an organization to become more sustainable. So looking at our, we're not a manufacturing organization. So, we had to look at things like how our people work, how we travel, the offices we use, so look at ways that we can make those more sustainable as well. So I've been involved in, I guess, two things. One, our outbound story to helping our customers, and secondly, working with a team of folks internally that we've called Citrix ambassadors to help us become a more sustainable organization ourselves.
In terms of your customers, Jerry, have they been leaning on you for sustainable solutions, or coming to you with requests for sustainability measures?
I think a bit of both. I think it's quite interesting, actually. We have some customer case studies that we worked with, specific customers. The University of Cambridge is one example of where we helped them move to low energy devices. But what we found is we often go to customers, and depending on who you're talking to within that organization, they have very different views on what sustainability means and what actually they can do to achieve goals. And I'm talking really about, I guess, decarbonization here. But if you go even broader into the whole sort of ESG side of things, the social goals as well. But if I'm talking to people like risk officers or sustainability officers, they're probably looking at the core things that the organization does, right? What facilities it has, manufacturing, if it's finance, what assets they have under management. They're not really thinking about how IT and how their people work can impact how sustainable they are. And if you talk to IT, they're probably very focused on, giving people a good user experience, making sure it's secure, but don't really necessarily think about, the impact that has on the environment or how they could be agents for change. And I'm painting with very broad brush here because there's obviously people who are very forward thinking on this. But I think we managed to do is kind of bring those two groups together. So get people talking, and there's something you brought up, Steve, just before we went on there about that common language, I think, between different groups. So we could talk to the sustainability people within an organization about how IT could help, or educate IT about how they could make their organization more sustainable so they can have a common conversation across the board. And then obviously present specific product solutions that could help them achieve those outcomes as well.
And how much do you think, Lindsay, educating the public sector, specifically the public sector, is a key to unlocking the social value and sustainability vault, or are they already up to the line, so to speak?
No, I think it's one of the major things actually we need to consider is how we educate within the public sector, and just building on what Jerry's saying, that kind of collaborative approach of talking to sustainability colleagues, talking to IT colleagues, but also having procurement colleagues around the table at that point in time is quite a game changer, and that's what needs to happen. We need to upskill in those areas. Procurement, I think, is traditionally seen as a bit of a process, and we need to almost change that thinking and move it into the procurement can add value if we are engaged at the right point in time and we build our level of understanding. So even if I use my experience, I couldn't profess to be an expert in sustainability. There's some fantastic colleagues out there who have that expertise. But what I do have is a willingness to learn, and I genuinely believe that willingness to learn is within the public sector. That is their ethos to kind of make sure they're delivering the best outcomes. So it's how do we make accessible training practical accessible training to help upskill in those areas, to actually put procurement in place that can deliver the value that we need them to deliver. And then we need to go on into how do we measure that value through the procurement, and how do we make the procurers understand that. And it is a very, very steep learning curve that we're going to have to go through to make sure that we can do it. And I think one of the really important things to address is within public sector procurement, the range of experience is huge, but also the types of organisations that you'll deal with are significantly different. You could have CCS in one sense, and then you'll have a local parish council in another sense that might not have a procurement colleague in there. So it's finding that balance and making sure everybody's got access to skills or access to people with those skills that can help drive that forward. But ultimately, procurement needs to be around the table. I think they need to be involved in those types of discussions to build our own knowledge, as well as help deliver what we can deliver through the procurement exercise.
And then do you think then that the working from home culture that the public sector has almost been forced to adopt is going to make that sluggish, or do you think there's going to be a bit of an acceleration because of it?
So from what I can say, I think an acceleration actually. I think people are working very differently, and I think public sector organisations are engaging with their employees differently to give them access to different tools and techniques to kind of help them on that journey. I think the working from home, there's various elements to kind of social value and sustainability in regards to your output from your procurement, but also the individual's values and how they want to work. I think in general, the public sector is moving to a different type of work, and they're not as rigid in terms of how they might have worked traditionally. It's becoming a lot more flexible. But I think that's different. It's a different element to how we deliver it through procurement. I think procurement has, we've got some fantastic experiences in procurement, and there's loads of best practice out there. What the challenge is it's not necessarily accessible. And I think it's one of the things that we've talked about in the past, Steve, is people don't know what they don't know. And it's how do we make that information accessible? How do we make a procurer that might be one day procuring pens and pencils, and the next day they're asked to support on an IT procurement? How do we make that information accessible, and how do they learn, and how do they apply the tools and techniques that they've got access to make sure they're getting the best outcomes? And it is very different in public sector organisations, and it's fantastic in the larger organisations that have more resources, can implement full category management strategies, where you've got individuals that have a lot more industry expertise and have that level of information, and if they don't know where to access it. But we've also got colleagues who aren't in such large departments and are kind of by themselves, and we need to be able to make sure they can access the right information to deliver the best outcomes as well. But I think we need to get everybody to a level playing field, and it's how do we bring a central point of information or learning information to procurers, because I definitely think the willingness to learn is there in that public sector remit.
I do feel there's a comment in from a gentleman called John, who's asking about us leaving the EU, a consultative paper. I'm going to lean on probably the environmental bill that hasn't been signed off yet, but he comments that it's all fine, everybody trying to adopt sustainability in their day job, but unless there's pressure from a compliance and an auditory point of view, then it's going to be probably difficult for people to get that across the line. So the way I read that is within the Environment Bill, there's a part in there that gives the Secretaries of State of each department, major department, the authority to insist that procurement will go about life slightly differently, particularly with regards to net zero. And I think that COP26 this year could be a real focal point for not just for procurers or staff within local and central government, but for suppliers to get their act together, to get their messaging right, Jerry, when we talk about syntax, so that you can't be everything to everybody, but as long as you're being genuine to the integrity of your brand and your product position and helping the customer understand what that is, then at least they can make a decision based on fact rather than, say, a greenwashing element, which I'm fearful of this year, if I'm brutally honest, as the noise within the field of sustainability becomes quite amplified, if you like, because there's a lot of money going into Build Back Better, there's a lot of money going into Build Back Greener, and of course that will then attract people that want to share in the spoils. But ultimately, we need to be able to demonstrate scientifically almost that, let's say decarbonisation, that we can help client decarbonise in a manner that's in keeping with what they are trying to achieve. I think that's the important point, is I get the feeling that from a procurement point of view, that the procurer might not know what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there to unpick, Steve, but I think there definitely, to take a few of the points out of it, there's definitely, as we said earlier, groundswell of sentiment, and there's always a risk of this getting diluted, right? I guess greenwash is probably one term for it, but again, people attaching sustainable labels to initiatives that probably aren't really moving the needle, aren't really changing anything. But I think as individuals and as parts of organizations, we can do what we can do in the remit of our roles or within our organizations. But I think there's amplification working together. So for us, I see that as working with broader partners. Across our partner ecosystem, because the solutions we have may address specific use cases within an organization. But if we work with larger partners in that space, whether it's a cloud partner like Microsoft or a device partner, we can achieve greater results. And I think I did a webinar last week with a local council. We talked a lot about how it was very much a combined partnering solution. And I think that's where things like procurement come into this, having IT goals match to business outcomes, but those match to sustainable goals as well. I think one of the questions that came in was about, the regulatory framework about that. And I know that was particularly about a paper affecting procurement, but I think there is going to need to be a balance between regulation and also government pressure and governance as well, and work between different groups within to achieve these outcomes as well, because I don't think we can do these in silos. I also think for it to be meaningful as well, there has to be measures. We have to start, we have to understand what we're trying to achieve, the baselines where we're at now. So, for example, I think there's something like 74% of local councils have declared a climate emergency, which is great. Well, it's not great, it's terrible, but it's great that there's a response out there. But I think it's then, what does that turn into in real terms, in actions? How can we support them as vendors? How can we support them in the procurement process? How can we partner with them to have meaningful actions that help them address some of those concerns?
With regards to the procurement piece in the chat there, Lindsay, is that something you want to pick up?
Yeah, so I've just had a quick scroll through the chat, and I think there's a number of questions come in about the green paper transforming public procurement, and I completely agree. I think it will be a bit of a game changer, and I think one of the key elements that I think will be that game changer, and I think somebody's addressed it in the chat as well, is the proposal to have some central oversight. So if I kind of can split this into two parts, obviously we've had the procurement policy note that's mandated central government to evaluate social value and attract a percentage weighting on all central government contracts. I think the first thing there is that over time will filter into the various areas of the public sector, although it's not mandated in those areas, as procurers learn from best practice, as we see that go through, as as suppliers bid back using that model, we'll see the outcomes that can be achieved, and that will grow. So I think that's one element of it. The second element that's proposed in the procurement green paper is about that central oversight. And I think this is absolutely something that we need at this moment in time. I believe, my opinion, is that it is a little bit diluted in that if we had a central oversight body that could also look at the skills within organisations and help them upskill in certain areas within procurement, if they could look at the outputs coming out of that organisation and the outcomes that are being delivered by their procurement teams, and if they are not up to standard and not meeting what we need to have in place to meet future targets, then they can be addressed. At this moment in time, I don't believe there's enough support and access to help that we can make those changes quickly and effectively, whereas the new proposal, the oversight section, is really proposing to have a much stronger oversight of all public procurement. And the key takeaway is that's not an oversight of criticism. I'm reading that as an oversight of actually, if you're not able to deliver, we're here to help and we can share information, and I think that's really critical. I think the other thing with the green paper is, based on my reading of it, I think they're simplifying the processes and making the regulations a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to navigate will make the bid back process a lot easier as well. And I think it means that it'll be easier from a public sector perspective, easier from the suppliers bidding into the public sector, which can only then lead us to get better outcomes at the end. Now, clearly, there's going to be a significant time of change that we're going to have to go through. There'll be another learning curve as procurers get to grips with new legislation as it comes into force. But ultimately, the paper is focused on awarding the right supplier the right contract, and that as well, it's just down to price, it's not down to quality. There's social considerations as part of that as well. One area I do think we probably might want to delve into a little bit more detail is how social value is evaluated. And in the green paper, the evaluations is fairly light in my opinion, and I know we've got the policy note around how it will be evaluated, but I think for me we could have gone that step further of actually going from strategy of an organisation to what their aims and objectives are, how it transposes into departmental policies and statements that they need to adhere to, down into your procurement policy with specific actions that can come out of that are built into your procurement process. So quite often, I've seen in the past, we'll run really good procurements and we'll specify elements of value that we see as being important, but they don't necessarily link to what the organisation has defined as their overarching objectives. So I think we could have gone that step further and kind of give more indication to both procurers and to suppliers bidding into the public sector, how we make those connections and how we are clearer with our suppliers as to how what value we want from this procurement and how we can try and achieve that. I think overall the green paper is really good. I think it's a fantastic step in the right direction, and I know it's still out for consultation, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out and what the final legislation is. But I think it's a huge step forward from the regulations that we're operating within at the minute, and it will hopefully help us drive innovation and value from procurement.
And as somebody who sits on the other side of some of those tenders and RFIs and RFPs, we're seeing increased scrutiny on our side as well. So we're seeing, I do with the sort of wide EMEA market, but we're seeing increased scrutiny on what are environmental credentials, what are supply chain credentials. Also, where previously we might have been asked, had we a sustainability policy? Now we're being asked for specific evidence on that. Are we following a science-based approach? What details and evidence can we supply? Are we signed up to things like CDP? All of this, and I think with each iteration that we're seeing from organizations, they're asking more and more of these questions. So I think at the moment, I would agree. It's still, I think someone said in the comments, it's weighted too low. It is, but the weighting is growing year on year. And I think, again, I'm mainly on the private sector side, but I think private and public, that weighting is growing and the importance of it is growing. And that's also reflected in the way that a lot of people are starting to change the way they engage with particular suppliers. If you don't have certain certifications, you're not following certain standards, you may be easily removed from the list related to those specific sustainability or other social measures as well.
I think once we get the syntax right and the playing field level for industry and supply, I mean, bear in mind that the supply is down. You know, tarmac on the roads depends. It is so broad for public sector procurement, and I know you have category specialists, but you know, it's got to be a fairly level playing field. And once that's understood by the actors involved, then they can address what needs to be done, and that weighting can be fair for everybody. And the reason I kind of think of it like that is that if you have a global organization, say like Citrix, who are doing amazing things globally, but let's say on a local government perspective, maybe not so impactful right at the end of my garden path or on my street, it doesn't mean you're not creating a social value that I enjoy. It means it's being done on a much bigger scale. So I think there are knobs and dials that need to be turned up and turned down, like, for instance, Scope 3 emissions. So one of the things that Circular are hell-bent on, and we're engaging with some serious third-party verification guys to look at the statements that we make about Scope 3 emissions. So if you have a reuse model, which obviously Citrix can help with, the benefit to the councils, 74% of which have declared a climate emergency, is they have an impact to their Scope 3 emissions. They don't indirectly let off CO2. So three brand new laptops, the production of which will let off about a ton of CO2, is equivalent to a 3-bedroom house here in the UK. So if you don't do that, then ultimately you've stopped that event from happening. But that's not to say that the streets in Brighton, where I live, are any cleaner by that happening. It means that the effect of climate change, the global effect, is changing. And so that's something that I'm trying to shape for local and central government. And I go back to the DEFRA Greening ICT paper, by the way, which was pushed through with Adam Turner. It's looking to put a responsibility on procurement to adopt a reuse model, to avoid unnecessary resource usage, in that there's only 100% of anything. So we're running thin on resources. And what I think COVID has shown us is that the supply chain is incredibly fragile. It's designed in a way so that things that come from the mine to the shelf and then the user's desk happen in a very quick fashion. When COVID kind of gets in the middle of that, or the pandemic gets in the middle of that, it fractures the supply chain. So the client has to look for alternatives. And by looking for the alternative, they can then ask those bigger, deeper questions about, okay, what things are no longer acceptable to my procurement? What are the things that I'm going to interest myself and my team in? And what things am I going to try and impress on my suppliers to make sure that they comply with our own blueprint, if you like? And I see that. I see a change.
Yeah, I thought it was a good point. I think that the supply chain, I guess, fragility, and when you have things like just-in-time manufacturing that's so dependent on that, it's another example of, well, we started this at the very start of the conversation, right? What changed last year? And I think that realization that, global supply chains are dependencies on those, the way we procure and use devices needs to change as well. And I think both at the on the business side, whether private or public, but also on the individual side as well. So you've seen an upswell in interest in devices that are repairable, batteries are replaceable. We saw, Apple's announcement about their board being metric on, the environmental impact of as an organization. We had a similar announcement from our board as well, because there's a realization that the users out there, whether they're at home or as part of their employees of an organization, they don't want that, I guess, moral responsibility of using devices that are potential detrimental impacts. And then as an organization as well, you don't want to be exposed when something like this happens. I was working with one of my banking customers last year, and they needed to expand server capacity to support working from home users. And they just literally couldn't get the servers. The supply chain was, had been disrupted. So again, it's got people thinking about different alternatives approach, mixtures of cloud and on-premise, that hybrid approach, where you procure, when you procure. And all of this has to be bundled into as well about the long-term impacts of that. Can we sweat assets for longer? Can we get more out of assets? Can we use alternative approaches so that the Raspberry Pis as endpoints, both cost-effective and low energy? And then you get back into the whole social challenges as well about more and more people needing access to IT. I think somebody brought up this in the chat about ICT not being very engaged with the local community. I think indirectly we're not, but I think this has been a year where people who didn't normally do IT or digital at all have done more Zoom calls and more online shopping than they ever had in their life. So I think digital and IT is even more front and center. But I think there's still a desire for us we need to be more engaged and help people understand the overall impact of that and how they can make better choices as well about devices and other online habits.
There's an interesting comment here from Chris, who's commented, what concerned me during the pandemic and interruption to supply chains has been the terrible working conditions in terms of modern slavery and health and safety. Things appear to have got worse, but worried that the first world has decided to look away. That's a fairly broad statement. I understand it. It's complicated. I think within the IT space, I can only really comment with authority in the IT space. There are, it's a very deep and very wide supply chain. And I know that the OEMs are hell-bent on moving away from bonded labor, from modern slavery, and all of the things that encompasses. And for sure, the public sector insist on the Modern Slavery Act being adhered to, Lindsay, for suppliers wanting to engage with the public sector. That is not to say that there isn't modern slavery in the supply chains, because it's a very difficult thing to monitor, particularly when you're procuring from multiple geographies around the world. I do think, though, that things will get better. I worry sometimes, though, that when the weighting is purely on price, and maybe we've seen a bit of that in the bridging the digital divide to education. There's been comments in the press about the DFE buying really cheap product to get into schools that didn't work. You might have had a virus. Look, it's not the intention of the DFE to do harm. Their only interest is to do good by their client, being the student and their parents. It has a duty to spend funds correctly, but where the public sector rints down on price, there's really only one place in the supply chain that can come from, and that is the human side. And so I think there needs to be a careful balance between getting the weighting of social and environmental measures within procurement and the ask correct and the metrics correct, getting the right, so it kind of boils down to what is best value as opposed to what is cheapest price.
Yeah. And
then combining all things to create whatever value is represented to the procurer. That is what it is. That is the blueprint from which they will buy.
I think there's got to be a level of acknowledgement as well, that it has to be proportionate. So what one organisation comes out with in terms of, say, a weighting on value might not be right for a different organisation for what they are procuring. So each project, each procurement should be looked at on its own merits around what you're trying to achieve from going out and spending this money. What value are you trying to achieve? And I think the schools example is a really interesting one, and how there was examples of weightings of 100% price. I can understand the logic, I can understand the reason, I can understand their approach, but I do believe had they not been under pressure of time-sensitive pressures, making sure it was accessible to children kind of yesterday, we might have come up with a different approach to that project and projects of a similar nature, because I fundamentally believe that nobody in the public sector is operating in a way that they don't want to achieve the best outcomes. I think there's other pressures in the last 12 months that have driven the decisions that we have to hold our hands up and say, yes, perhaps they weren't the best, but we've got to learn from those and we've got to improve. And it's the steps that we take to improve, and what have we learned from those is what's important to me.
Yeah, it's a fair comment. I think the last 12 months have been unprecedented, that word again. But it provides the opportunity to really look hard at what value, what represents value. Yeah. You know, to some local authorities, it might be working with a reseller partner that is situated, or they're a big employer of people. They might be situated in that city or town. Therefore, it's likely they'll be spending their taxable pounds in that location, which generates some social value and so on and so forth. So it means different things to different people.
Yeah.
It absolutely does. And I think that's what everybody needs to recognise. That's what's really important. It's different to every organisation, and it's different to every individual. So every project will be looked at from a different slant, depending on what they're trying to achieve. What it then comes to is, how do we measure that value, and how do we make sure that whatever's been put in place from that procurement, that we are measuring it effectively so we can deliver the value that we've set out to deliver. And I think in an IT space, that's certainly something that from a procurement perspective, again, it's another learning thing that we need to do, and we can do that with colleagues in IT, colleagues in the sustainability arena. And we need to understand the impact of that, so that when we come to the next iteration, we've learned from that and we can move forward again. I don't think there's an answer today. I think that's probably what I'm trying to say, Steve. I don't think there's an answer today into how we address social value. I think it's an iterative process that we are going to continue to learn to enhance the value that we can create through procurement. But it has to be collaborative. It has to be with all of the stakeholders around the table, because I don't think one individual area has all the expertise needed to deliver it.
I was going to say, I think Lindsay called out there that, you know, different organizations will have different requirements, but if we had at least common language, and I think this comes back to that point we made earlier, and there's actually a point in the chat as well about common standards, and it's often hard to come up with common standards. There's a great internet meme of, we have 14 competing standards, we need one overarching standard. 1 week later, we have 15 competing standards. But I think we still, at the very least, have to get common language that people can use when they're having those discussions. And I think some of that is going to require legislation probably, or regulation, but some of it is just us working in groups with our peers and trying to work this out and be clear in the conversations we have with each other and with our stakeholders as well.
I think it's interesting that there was a comment further down from Daniel who has basically commented there's no downside to wanting to be sustainable. There's no downside to wanting to do the right thing, and the bridge to kind of nirvana is probably an infinite one, because you cross it and then you realize it's a much longer bridge. So long as you're taking the right steps today for the benefit of tomorrow, then that is the right thing, with all the information that you've got at your disposal. And I think, going back to what you commented on earlier, Lindsay, which was, you can be forgiven for not knowing what you don't know, but now there are resources available to allow you to widen your thinking and to appreciate that what you didn't know is actually really important to what you have to know.
Yeah.
And then figuring out how quickly you can just take bite-sized pieces at getting moving with it. Because if we're going to wait for legislation, and if we're going to wait for central government, there'll be a new election, there'll be maybe a different agenda, and it's just too painful. You know, the pace at which we need to address certain issues needs to be taken on board locally by local gov, supported by central gov. And I go back to COP26. If there's enough pressure on that event, most things, in my opinion, will lead to, within the United Nations SDGs, they'll point in some shape or form to climate. You stop doing this, it has a positive effect to climate. You do that, it has a positive effect to climate. So we can start thinking and doing certain things that will help local government address their declaration to climate, that then enables and empowers the centre to take on board what they have done locally and then adopt that internally. And then it's almost like a reversing into central government that can happen. Because from an auditing point of view, Lindsay, I think so long as the procurer can justify reasons for procurement, then legislatively they are not exposed to risk.
Yeah, I do agree. I do agree. I think the one thing I think we'll probably need to think about is if you're sitting in a local authority and assume we've got access to the resources and we know what we need to put in place in a particular procurement. There's different factors that you're going to be managing to oppose if you're sitting in a university or if you're sitting in the centre. So, and I think there's lessons that we can learn from each vertical that we need to share. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that everybody's trying to do the right thing, and it's how we build upon that and how we share that knowledge, how we get access to that information. So there's lots of really interesting conversations that we can have. There's some fantastic areas of best practice. There's some great individuals that you can talk to upskill and to understand what you're trying to do. But it's having access to that and sharing that and going through that in practical steps. And it's only once we've done that practical application of it that we then learn from it, and then we can build from it. So I think it will come with legislation. I don't disagree with you in that point, but I think we have to then go through the processes to get the structure in place to be able to deliver the outcomes that we need to deliver. Don't know if I've explained that very well, what I was trying to say, but hopefully you get the gist.
But I think just to pick on one point to that was the structure part, and Steve, something you said earlier about, I think it was the comment about there being, if we focus on sustainability or sustainable outcomes, there's no bad approach, and I agree. But I think the one thing to be aware of is that we have finite time and finite resources. So without that structure, there's a chance that we go off and do 20 different things or 50 different things, both as, generally, do we plant more trees? Do we use less plastic bags? Do we, drive more electrical vehicles? All of these are probably good things, but, which of them is the most, will have the best knock-on effect? In procurement and within IT, where is the best place to spend our investments? What's the best policies? What are the best weightings that we can put into our tenders or whatever? And which are, it may not even be the best one today. I think somebody again commented, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough," or a variation on that. But we may not be able to do exactly what we want today. But if we put processes in place, we can take those steps to at least move things forward and be on the right path.
That's good. Can I just remind everybody there's an in-house poll. So below the chat, you'll see a little icon. If you could take a moment to have a look at that, if you haven't done already, that'd be really useful for getting feedback. We're going to be wrapping up fairly shortly. And Lindsay, I would ask you this. if there are one or two easy win things that the audience can do to get involved more quickly, what would those be?
Sorry, to get involved with?
In sustainability or social value, to move from zero to somewhere.
First and foremost, I think talk to your suppliers and talk to your colleagues in IT. They're the experts in their field, and they will have lots of innovations that perhaps you as a procurer aren't aware about or haven't yet had to procure. So I think the first thing is collaborating with the network that you have, that you're procuring for your critical stakeholders. And I think the second thing is, once you've kind of got an awareness of the art of the possible, you're moving from buying new kit to remanufactured kit. It's going out and finding those practical tools and techniques that can help you do that better. So is the training, is the best practice guidance that you can access, that you can read up on, digest, and do your job better by understanding that. So I think they're the two big things for me. Really engage with your suppliers and with your colleagues in IT is critical, because by the nature of their role, they are likely to know more in this space than as a procurement professional, but you can learn a huge amount of information that you can take away to add value to your procurement role.
How about you, Jerry?
So Lindsay stole my first one, or at least thought about it before I did. But I completely agree with her, right? Talk to your colleagues in IT. And especially if you already work within sustainability within your organization and you're not having that conversation, make sure you're including them. If you're having that conversation, great, because I think you're ahead of the game in comparison to some other organizations. Definitely talk to your suppliers and vendors. We want to have those conversations with you. Our partner network want to, and talk to your peers as well, because there's people there's always going to be front runners who are making real progress in this, who have real ideas. There's people who need encouragement. So there's that opportunity there. I think the other part is just, keep aware, keep engaged. Again, similar to Lindsay's point as well. There's an awful lot of information out there, and that's continuing to grow over the years. Put out by vendors, by us, but put out by others as well, independently. I think there's a great opportunity to educate ourselves. This webinar has been education for me. I'm less exposed in general to the public sector procurement process. So again, take advantage of these. If there's one good thing or good point about sitting at home the whole time, is we have a little bit more time to look at webinars and maybe do the background reading as well.
Well, that's well put. I think from my side is just to know that there's not a one shoe fits all. You might have opposing thoughts from competing suppliers from the supply side, but ultimately, if you take a step back and appreciate that everyone's trying to do the best by them and by their clients and by what they can and can't do, not everyone has 100% of the solutions. That is for sure. And it is, I think, I keep writing down, is collaborating, understanding, get a meaning for what sustainability means to you personally, how that is within your team, within your organization. What you can affect change on and what you want to affect change on might be different things. And where there's a skills gap, then it's just a case of finding the bridge between what you know and what you need to know to allow you to get going with it. I would like to thank Lindsay and Jerry. We're going to share the poll with the audience by email with a follow-up with the details of the guys on the presentation. And again, thank you very much to the audience for participating. We managed to hold on to most of you, which is probably more down to Lindsay and Jerry than to myself. So listen, thank you so much, guys. I do appreciate your time.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
That's great. Thank you.